Vital forces of cosmogenesis. Fohat, Ākāśa, and ether in stanza 5 of The Secret Doctrine. My name is William Wilson Quinn. Before there was motion in the utter stillness and quietude of chaos, or the infinite and boundless void and plenum of space, there was yet no cosmos nor manifested cosmic energies that would come to fuel universal creation through a manvantara. At the moment of the first breath, being the word or logos as the first appearance of motion, the process of emergence from pralaya into manvantara began, taking seriatim the form of numerically expanding emanations. As part of and with these emanations emerged the cosmic forces and energies that began to enable the subtle or noumenal emanations to take phenomenal form in the formal realm of substance or matter. This vast and profound process of cosmogony, eternally cyclic and imbued with the omniscient intelligence of nature, was wisely committed to symbol and language by humanity's enlightened forebears from great antiquity. Remnants of this remarkable literary legacy are found in such works as the 129th hymn of the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda, being the Nasadiva Sukta, or Hymn of Creation, as well as in the first 7 stanzas of Dhyan from the books of QT, whose translations form the basis of Volume 1, Book 1, Part 1 of The Secret Doctrine by H.P. Blavatsky, or HPB. The first 4 stanzas in Volume 1 of The Secret Doctrine, respectively, deal with 1. The unconditioned and indescribable absolute, or one all, during pralaya, before the first breath or motion. 2. The dawn of differentiation or swelling as the ineffable preparation toward emergence within the one all immediately prior to the primal ray flashing into the germ. 3. The reawakening of the universe through this flashing at the moment of the first breath or motion, at the highest or earliest stage in the formation of manifested existence. And 4, the stage of creation of the gods, or emanation of the hierarchy of conscious divine powers or beings, which as discrete intelligences direct and guide the creation of worlds, the entire manifested universe. What then follows these first 4 stages is an account of the beginning or formation of the substantive manifested universe, or creation of worlds, as set forth in stanza 5. In essence, stanza 5 deals with the processes of the formation of worlds. Throughout this 5th stage, which is the subject of stanza 5, the emanation of active cosmic energies, such as Fohat, play indispensable roles in the cosmogonic process. Even though in The Secret Doctrine we are first introduced to the Tibetan term Fohat in stanza 3, it is in stanza 5 that its role and function in the creativity of world formation and in the operation of the manifested universe generally is discussed in most detail. Intertwined with this function and operation of Fohat is its utilization of Ākāśa in effecting its sacred light and life-giving mission of manifestation in Manvantara, universal formation, from the highest stratum of universal cosmic Ākāśa to the lowest material stratum through which this principle operates, which is that of ether. So now we turn our attention specifically to the contents and structure of stanza 5. Mastering the understanding of the liminal and pivotal phase of cosmogony in between complete cosmic homogeneity and cosmic heterogeneity, as set forth in stanza 5, is not easy. HBB confesses that stanza 5, quote, is perhaps the most difficult of all the stanzas to explain, end quote, owing to the fact that it is so very mystical because, quote, the whole mystery of evolutionary creation is contained in it, end quote. Nonetheless, we must here seek to summarize, or at least to outline, stanza 5, which is comprised of 6 shlokas, or verses. HBB writes that it deals generally with the process of world formation. Being only slightly more specific, she adds that this stanza sets forth a sequence of events, or more properly of emanations, emerging into substantial manifestation. These events begin, first, with the appearance of the Lipika, and the appearance of the primordial 7, being the Dhyan Kohans, who emerge along 7 rays. These spiritual beings are not material entities, but rather powerful vortices of spiritual intelligence, whose appearances further include a vast host of subordinate celestial beings and intelligences manifesting in hierarchical order, some of which are referred to as the builders, some as the sons of light. As the emanating emergence continues, these celestial entities become so numerous that, as HBB warns, quote, the mind is lost in this endless enumeration of celestial hosts and beings, each having its distinct task in the ruling of the visible cosmos during its existence, end quote. Next appears diffused cosmic matter, followed by the fiery whirlwind, or rotai, within this cosmic matter, which HBB further describes as, quote, the first stage in the formation of a nebula, end quote. Thereafter, the, quote, nebula condenses, and after passing through various transformations, forms materially a solar universe, a planetary chain, or a single planet, end quote. All in a rotary motion, either spinning axially or orbiting another planetary body. Finally, the Lipika, among the highest of these trans-cosmic intelligent deities, and described variously as spirits of the universe and recorders of the karmic ledger, establish the strict parameters of cosmic and spiritual evolution. This they do in part by creating a ring-pass knot, not unlike a closed border, designed to regulate, mostly by preclusion, the transition of all life forms that may descend or ascend on this universal evolutionary arc. While stanza 5's basic sequence in the process of world formation is unquestionably an indispensable link in the chain of cosmic creation, and as such worthy of close examination, our subject here, while inextricably connected to this link, focuses on Fohat as a specific intrinsic force in world formation. Fohat's creative role is the principal subject of shlokas 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the 6 shlokas of stanza 5. More narrowly, our precise subject is the motive, cohesive, and informing roles played by Fohat and by Ākāśa and ether as the operative components or forces in world formation in both its earliest and in its later stages, and how these components differ from and share similarities with one another. The significance of the role of these collaborating features in cosmogonic world formation can hardly be overstated, especially as it relates to Fohat, a significance underscored by HPB in describing the centrality and importance of stanza 5, together with the fact that 4 of its 6 shlokas are devoted to Fohat. In addition to these facts, the term Fohat also appears in 7 separate shlokas in 4 of the 7 stanzas in Volume 1 of the Secret Doctrine, though it's center stage, so to speak, in stanza 5. The terms Ākāśa and ether, and the latter's philosophical parent, aether, spelled with the diphthong ae, do not appear in any of the shlokas per se, although these terms appear frequently in HPB's commentaries to these 7 stanzas. As was noted, the first appearance of the term Fohat does not, in fact, occur in stanza 5, but rather in stanza 3. In shloka 12 of stanza 3, it is said that Svabhavat sends Fohat to, quote, harden the atoms, end quote. Svabhavat is a rather difficult term to define. HPB describes it as, quote, the plastic essence that fills the universe and is the root of all things, end quote, which in a substantive form, as found here in Buddhism, can be likened to Mula Prakriti in Hinduism. The Adept Kutumi, or KH, refers to Svabhavat as, quote, both passive and active, pure spirit essence in its absoluteness and repose, pure matter in its finite and conditioned state, end quote. In the very brief commentary on shloka 12, HPB limits her exposition to noting that, quote, Fohat hardens the atoms, that is, by infusing energy into them. It is through Fohat that the ideas of the universal mind are impressed upon matter. Some faint idea of the nature of Fohat may be gathered from the appellation cosmic electricity, sometimes applied to it. Described in today's terms, that cosmic electricity appellation might instead be reworded as cosmic atomic energy, given that it is Fohat that, quote, infuses energy into atoms, end quote. So now we turn our attention to circumscribing and discussing the nature and details of Fohat. Fohat is as indispensable an operative force in universal life and human life now as it was at the beginning during the generative processes of world formation, as recorded in stanza 5. Of these 2 existential roles or aspects of Fohat, the generative and the operative, that which directly impacts the human realm is necessarily of more relevance to most humans, though there is not always a clear line of demarcation between these two modes of Fohat. HPB acknowledged the diaphanous interface between these two modes of Fohat and their overlapping shift from the generative ideation of the gods, meaning most likely the Lipika and the Dhyan Kohans, to the active operation of Fohat. She wrote that Fohat, quote, is, metaphysically, the objectivized thought of the gods and the messenger of cosmic and human ideations, the active force in universal life, end quote. For our purposes, the key words here are human ideations, given that human beings in their highest states are effectively a pinnacle, if not a core purpose, of cosmogenesis. The highest ideations of humans may to some degree share in the Dzu, spelled D-Z-Y-U, of stanza 5, shloka 2. HPB informs us that Dzu is the, quote, one real magical knowledge or occult wisdom, end quote, and that Dzu becomes Fohat and, quote, is the expression of the collective wisdom of the Dhyani Buddhas, end quote, as a sort of noumenal storehouse of esoteric wisdom upon which their objectivized thought is based. It is interesting to note that her language in this commentary closely tracks that of the adepts. We are unsure whether Moria or KH, where they state that, quote, Dzu becomes Fohat when in its activity, active agent of will or electricity, end quote. Dzu is thus noumenal and inactive, while in its alternate or manifest form as Fohat, it is phenomenal and active. And in this latter form, it is both generative and operative, and continues to be metaphysical from the standpoint of empirical human perception, as it inheres in and enlivens everything as spiritual light. Regarding the essential nature and attributes of Fohat, descriptions can be approximately separated by its roles as generative and operative, and as to this latter, its operation within the human realm. Among the most succinct definitions is that by HPB in her Theosophical Glossary, where she defines Fohat as, quote, a term used to represent the active, final potency of the Shakti, or female reproductive power in nature, the essence of cosmic electricity, an occult Tibetan term for Daivi Prakriti, homogeneous primordial light, which, when differentiated, becomes Fohat, and in the universe of manifestation, the ever-present electrical energy and ceaseless destructive and formative power. Esoterically, it is the same, Fohat being the universal propelling vital force, at once the propeller and the resultant, end quote. Unpacking this terse statement, we can see at once the difficulty in bifurcating Fohat into its generative and operative modes. First, the reproductive power in nature is also the initial ingenerate and productive cosmogonic power in nature. Second, since reproduction is an intrinsic value of active vital force or universal life, terms used by HPB to describe Fohat, then the initial or prototypical productive activity of Fohat in world formation is continuously repeated and sustained throughout the Manvantara, or manifestation, in its reproductive mode. while Fohat, as HPV notes, is simultaneously the propeller and the resultant propulsion, though its results are more than propulsion alone, at the same time it remains dimorphic, which adds to the difficulty in grasping its essence. Nonetheless, since our goal is to achieve as clear an understanding of Fohat and related energies as is possible, this bifurcation into generative or productive and operative or reproductive modes can be useful. This follows in part HPB's assertion that, quote, Fohat is the aggregate of all the spiritual creative ideations above and of all the electrodynamic and creative forces below, in heaven and on earth, end quote. As to the generative mode of Fohat, in its generative mode, HPB writes at length about Fohat in her commentary on Shloka 2c of stanza 5, which is more of a fulsome description than a succinct definition. Often using the masculine personal pronoun he to describe Fohat, which she elsewhere describes as an entity, she states there, through the span of several pages, that, quote, Fohat is one thing in the yet unmanifested universe and another in the phenomenal and cosmic world. In the unmanifested universe, Fohat is no more than this. Then Eros is the later brilliant winged Cupid, or love. Fohat has nothing to do with cosmos yet, since cosmos is not born, and the gods still sleep in the bosom of Father-Mother. He, meaning Fohat, is an abstract philosophical idea. He produces nothing yet by himself. He is simply that potential creative power in virtue of whose action the noumenon of all future phenomena divides, so to speak, but to reunite in a mystic supersensuous act and emit the creative ray, end quote. HPB adds that in this state of potential creative power, quote, Fohat is closely related to the one life, end quote, which she further describes as the unknown one and the infinite totality. From this emanates the manifested one, or the periodical manvantaric deity, in the form of Mahat, or universal mind, from which Fohat springs into active operation. Quote, by the action of the manifested wisdom, or Mahat, the reflection of the universal mind, which is cosmic ideation, and the intellectual force accompanying such ideation, becomes objectively the Fohat of the Buddhist esoteric philosopher, end quote. This statement comports with the statement by an adept that, quote, everything in the occult universe, which embraces all the primal causes, is based upon two principles: cosmic energy, Fohat or breath of wisdom, and cosmic ideation, end quote. With respect to the operative mode of Fohat in the manifested universe, it acts as the propelling vital force of life, and so underpins all reproduction, growth, and sentient life. HPB writes that, quote, Fohat, then, is the personified electric vital power, the transcendental binding unity of all cosmic energies, on the unseen as on the manifested planes, the action of which resembles, on an immense scale, that of a living force created by will, in those phenomena where the seemingly subjective acts on the seemingly objective and propels it into action. Fohat is not only the living symbol and container of that force, but is looked upon by the occultists as an entity. The forces he acts upon being cosmic, human, and terrestrial, and exercising their influence on all those planes respectively. On the earthly plane, his influence is felt in the magnetic and active force generated by the strong desire of the magnetizer." End quote. In another meaningful statement on the operative or secondary mode of Fohat, a statement that provides a usefully clear example of its nature, HPB adds that, quote, "In his secondary aspect, Fohat is the solar energy, the electric vital fluid, and the preserving fourth principle, the animal soul in nature, so to say, or electricity." End quote. One need only stand under an open sky on a warm and cloudless day and face the sun to feel both the light and the heat of the sun, of Fohat in its vital operative mode, to understand at least part of the scope and extent of its life-sustaining nature. In addition to the operative aspect of Fohat as a cosmic and solar force of vitality propelling growth and development, is his aspect of unifier or combiner of conscious phenomena. In his generative aspect, this attribute of Fohat was referred to by HPB as the centripetal and cohesive force of love. And in his operative aspect or mode, this force of Fohat acts as the agent of, quote, "the will of the creative logos, and unites and brings together all forms," end quote. And further, quote, "brings together the elemental atoms and makes them aggregate and combine," end quote. Through this mode then, Fohat, quote, "carries out in the formation of things, from the planetary system down to the glowworm and simple daisy, the plan in the mind of nature, or in the divine thought," end quote. This might be stated alternately as affecting the plan inherent in the objectivized, or Zu, thought of the highest celestial beings who emerged immediately prior to the diffuse cosmic matter upon whose subsequent aggregations our entire phenomenal or formal order is comprised. Though unitary in its essential nature, we have now examined the dual fundamental aspects or modes of Fohat. Yet even as the sovereign cosmic energy, Fohat does not operate or carry out its mission alone, but rather does so together with other components or tattvas of the manifested universe. Tattva is a Sanskrit word for a core element or aspect of reality, and the multiple tattvas each have their own respective roles and functions. Among these are Ākāśa and ether, which together form a cosmically pervasive tattva, and which have special relationships with Fohat. And so now we will turn our attention to a discussion of Ākāśa and ether. HPB informs us that, quote, "Fohat, running along the seven principles of Ākāśa, acts upon manifested substance, and by differentiating it into various centers of energy, sets in motion the law of cosmic evolution," end quote. This description is supported by the adepts, when one wrote that, quote, Fohat, who, vibrating along Ākāśa, runs along the lines of cosmic manifestation and frames all and everything, end quote. It is important to understand, in regard to these statements, that Ākāśa was already extant when Fohat emerged at creation as the objectivized thought of the Dhyani Kohans. This is so because the divine thoughts of these celestial beings, or intelligences, are objectivized as Fohat and appear in creation as emanations of the first breath, the Logos or Word, being the motion of sound, which is the rudiment of Ākāśa. Following the sequence of the stanzas, Fohat emerges after that initializing point. Moreover, HPB notes significantly that, quote, Ākāśa, whose characteristic property and rudiment is sound, as the word, occupies the whole containment of space, end quote. She elsewhere adds that Ākāśa has, quote, no attributes save one, which is sound. Like Fohat, Ākāśa is not easy to describe, having as it does multivalent roles and functions in the operation of cosmos, including in our everyday lives. Nonetheless, HPB does provide a formal definition, part of which is this, quote, Ākāśa, the subtle, supersensuous spiritual essence which pervades all space, the primordial substance erroneously identified with ether. But it is to ether what spirit is to matter, or Atma is to Kamarupa. It is in fact the universal space in which lies inherent the eternal ideation of the universe in its ever-changing aspects on the plane of matter and objectivity, and from which radiates the first logos, or expressed thought. This is why it is stated in the Puranas that Ākāśa has but one attribute, namely sound, for sound is but the translated symbol of logos, speech in its mystic sense, end quote. Yet, notwithstanding HPB's repeated assertions that Ākāśa has but one attribute, being sound, her further descriptions point to a variety of roles, whether these be attributes or not. For example, in the same definition above, she states that Ākāśa is also a form of power, which is, in another aspect, Kundalini. Ākāśa is also described as being the abode of Chidakasam, the field of primordial consciousness, which Akashic abode, Chidakasham, and cosmic consciousness occupy. Furthermore, Ākāśa also performs the role of a cosmic archive, in which, quote, the record of a person's past life relationships imperishably endures in the Ākāśa, and they can always be reviewed when, in any birth, the being evolves his latent spiritual powers, end quote. Elsewhere, HPB declares that, quote, occultism teaches that Ākāśa contains and includes the 7 centers of force, therefore the 7 tattvas, of which Ākāśa is the 7th, or rather their synthesis, end quote. In addition to these statements, in various places in her writings, HPB equates Ākāśa to Mula Prakriti, and also declares that, quote, the buddhi of man proceeds from the highest Ākāśa, end quote. Finally, we have a remarkable statement made by KH, in which he asserts that the adepts of his order quote, recognize but one element in nature, outside which there can be no nature, since it is nature itself, and which, as the Ākāśa, pervades our solar system, every atom being part of itself, and pervades throughout space, and is space, in fact. End quote. It should be clear from this array of roles and functions just cited that the operation of Ākāśa in manifestation is multivalent and multifunctional. Its relationship to Fohat is essentially one of sound to light, including all the frequencies or vibrations by which these emanate in their generative and operative roles. Quote, Fohat is the son of ether in its highest aspect. Ākāśa, the mother-father of the primitive seven and of sound or logos. Fohat is the light of the latter, or the light of Ākāśa. Ākāśa further shares another similarity with Fohat, which is that of being dimorphic. These two facets or modes are the higher or spiritual Ākāśa and its lower or material alter ego of ether. Stated succinctly, HBB informs us that, quote, esoterically, Ākāśa alone is divine space, which becomes ether only on the lowest and last plane, or our visible universe and earth, end quote. This then leads to the inquiry of what the nature and characteristics are of ether in its domain. In answer to this, it should first be noted that in several places in her writings, HBB takes pains to distinguish between the terms ether and aether, which are not the same. She states that, quote, ether is an element which follows the four elements that we admit and accept, and the aether is its abstract or general sense, end quote. She also adds that aether is, quote, the third principle of the cosmic septenary, end quote. But that in all cases, ether, because it is a material agent, is neither similarly spiritual nor philosophical as aether. For our purposes here, however, the focus shall be on ether and its characteristics. HBB partly defines the term. Quote, ether is a material agent, though hitherto undetected by any physical apparatus, whereas Ākāśa is a distinctly spiritual agent, identical in one sense with the anima mundi, end quote. She mentions ether elsewhere as semi-material, as, quote, the astral fluid in the womb of the universe, end quote, and as differentiated substance, unlike its divine sibling, Ākāśa. Most important, she groups ether with the other elements, or elementals, known in Sanskrit as the tanmatras, where she describes the, quote, 5 basic elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether, end quote, and adding elsewhere that ether is the synthesizer of all the elements, quote, since it contains all of them, end quote. Enough now has been said of the mystic dimorphic pole whose opposite ends are the related undifferentiated Ākāśa and the differentiated ether, and which are the core to the cosmogonic process by being the conductive routes along which cosmic electricity, or Fohat, runs to inspiritize and vitalize all the substantive realms of the universe. Before proceeding to a summary, whereby the cosmic components are reassembled within the cosmogonic sequence set forth in the 5th stanza of Zan, it is important to examine briefly the related life-sustaining universal energy of prana and its connection to the spiritual principle of the Sanskrit term jiva. These two terms, prana and jiva, are both central to ancient Hindu philosophy regarding cosmic energies and life force. And both also find expression in the Vedas and in the Vedanta, and there in multiple Upanishads. With regard to prana, HPB defines the term simply as, quote, life principle, the breath of life, end quote. And on the same page of her Theosophical glossary, defines pranamaya kosha as, quote, the vehicle of prana, life, or the linga sharira, a Vedantic term, end quote. Notably, prana is mentioned only 5 times in the entirety of Volume 1 of The Secret Doctrine, and they are mostly in passages quoted from other sources, or in footnotes, and all without any commentary or explanation, unlike the treatments given to Fohat, Ākāśa, and ether, which are mentioned and discussed throughout with detailed definition. The term jiva gets virtually identical treatment as prana in HPB's writings, like a similar one-line definition, quote, jiva being life as the absolute, the monad, also, or atma buddhi, end quote. She adds on the same page of the Theosophical glossary another one-line definition of jivatma as, quote, the one universal life, generally, but also the divine spirit in man, end quote. In similar fashion, the term prana appears only one time in the entire Mahatma letters to A.P. Senate in a chart that shows prana jivatma to be the life principle or second principle of the human being. The term jiva appears but 2 times in that book. When, first, the terms prana and jiva are so prominent in traditional Hindu metaphysics, and second, when these terms, especially prana, are defined by these 19th century theosophical writers in ways that seem to overlap, if not be quasi-synonymous with Fohat, one can only speculate as to why they are mentioned so infrequently in their aggregate writings. It might be that, as to jiva, while HPB states that it is a term designating the monad, or the atma buddhi, HPB and the adepts preferred using the terms spiritual ego and spiritual monad. But she also defines jiva as, quote, life as the absolute, end quote, which places it near Fohat that she described as, quote, universal life. One cannot be sure of the answers to these questions, but one tantalizing statement by HPB that includes all 3 of these terms may point to some clarity. She stated, quote, and so does prana, in parentheses jiva, pervade the whole living body of man, but alone, without having an atom to act upon, it would be quiescent, dead, would be in laya. It is the action of Fohat upon a compound or even a simple body that produces life, end quote. While it is not clear why HPB links prana to jiva here as equivalents, this observation of hers appears to suggest that while Fohat produces the life of man, once produced by Fohat, it is prana that sustains it, but only during its incarnate life. And so now we proceed to our summary. Forgetting not that our wider theme throughout this discussion has been cosmogenesis. That particular stage of cosmogenesis, which is the liminal or transitional formation of worlds, cryptically expressed by the 5th stanzas of Dhyan, has been our narrower focus. And, to repeat, this specific focus was trained upon the inextricable motive, cohesive, and informing roles played by Fohat and by Ākāśa and ether as the primary force or energy in affecting this formation of worlds, in both its initial generative and in its later operative modes. One indicium of the primacy of Fohat in this cosmogonic process is HPB's attribution of Fohat's, quote, transcendental binding unity of all cosmic energies, end quote, making Fohat the sovereign of such energies. In this regard, it is probably not accurate to classify Ākāśa as an energy, though as we have seen, it was described as containing power. Similarly, ether is also not an energy per se. But according to HPB, because ether, quote, pervades the densest solids as readily as water does a sponge, end quote, and also carries or transports as etheric vibrations the mystic energy of sound, such as in occult mantras, quote, it is according to the vibrations of ether that the effect is produced, end quote. Whether or not, therefore, Ākāśa and ether could arguably be unified as cosmic energies by and with Fohat remains an open question. Reaching a dispositive answer to this question, however, is not critical to our examination here. Not arguable is that prana is clearly capable of being classified as within the rubric of all cosmic energies. Unfortunately, the cosmogonic provenance of prana is provided neither by HPB nor the adepts, being mentioned only twice in passing in the commentaries to the first 7 stanzas of Zan. It is therefore unclear what role prana may play in cosmogenesis, if any, according to these theosophical authors. There is no doubt, however, according both to these authors and to the weight of Vedic and Vedantic tradition, that prana does play an indispensable and vital role in life on earth, so much so that in a paragraph chart, HPB literally equates it to oxygen. Quote, prana, life, the active power producing all phenomena. Oxygen, the supporter of combustion, the life-giving gas, the active chemical agent in all organic life. End quote. Fohat and its cosmic collaborators, whether components or energies, are the binding and unifying forces that keep cohered the mass of disparate and heterogeneous phenomena spinning about the manifested universe. We must remember that in its most noumenal and unmanifested state, Fohat is, as HPB stated, nothing other than love. That cohesive and binding latency that will manifest at the cosmogonic stage of the formation of worlds as their unifying force. In this regard, it is part of the immemorial Dzu, or occult wisdom, and, quote, absolute wisdom mirrors itself in its ideation, which, by a transcendental process superior to and incomprehensible by human consciousness, results in cosmic energy, as Fohat. Thrilling through the bosom of inert substance, Fohat impels it to activity and guides its primary differentiations on all the 7 planes of cosmic consciousness. End quote. And so it is, within the lower strata of these 7 cosmic planes, that our own individual human consciousnesses have come to abide for some finite time, ceaselessly drawn by that unifying cosmic force to the point of reintegration with the highest stratum of cosmic consciousness. Thank you for your attention.